much too complex, much too complex, too complex, too complex, too complex.
Good evening. My name is James K. Holder II. Some of you may know me as Sir James II, and I'd like to welcome you back to Not on My Watch. As always, I'd like to ask you to like, share, comment, and subscribe. I want you to retweet this and repeat this. If you're watching, today is July 19th, 2018, or perhaps you're watching on the 20th because I'm recording this a little bit later than normal. But today has been one of quite just exhaustive in nature. There's a lot going on, as always, within the resistance, and I am particularly flummoxed, disgusted, and sort of just dissatisfied with our government in general, and therefore I'm not that interested in talking about it. I want to talk about something else today. But first, of course, there's a little bit of housekeeping. Today, Donald Trump invited his long-term undercover lover, Vladimir Putin, to Washington, D.C. Apparently, this reunion will occur in the fall of this year, hopefully before the midterm elections. I don't know that it will impact some of the voters who constantly support Trump and continue to support him despite all of his advances and actions that clearly illustrate the fact that he is not someone who supports democracy, not a person who really has a backbone or a spine or a brain for that matter. But people continue to support him. I don't think that this meeting in the fall will stop people from supporting Donald Trump if they already were. And I guess that we remain to be seen until Election Day. We've got news that came out with the Mueller investigation. Y'all know I don't report on the Mueller investigation. I just don't. I feel like all that stuff's going to happen the way that it's going to happen. But many people are saying that Bernie Sanders is now implicated because his campaign strategist, Tad Devine, actually appeared 16 times in the evidence against Paul Manafort. This is in the form of like communications between Devine and Manafort directly. And to be fair, this is from like years before the 2016 election. We're talking about 2010 and around 2010 and maybe a little bit before that. So it wasn't like it was after the election or there were like bank statements or anything like that. Obviously, we haven't got any bank statements from the Bernie camp ever. But we'll see what that revolves around. This could be what leads people to believe and understand that Bernie Sanders was more than sort of what do you call it, a willing idiot, like one of the people who like doesn't necessarily want to help the enemy but does help the enemy. Some people think Bernie Sanders always was involved and wanted to be a part of the whole Russia scandal and deliberately made choices like not conceding to Hillary Clinton after he lost the primary, not actively campaigning for her, saying that he was campaigning for her in Wisconsin and then not doing it. All those types of actions have kind of piled up, and it leads people to believe that Bernie Sanders had some other interest and some alignment with Russia, or perhaps just some other body that was a part of the whole takeover of our government. And at this point, it's not that I don't care, but our solution to the problems that we face on a daily basis really have nothing to do with Bernie Sanders. I mean, he's a nobody. He's a flop, he's a fool, he's a fraud. And really, we just need him to get out of the way. There's people who still listen to him on the left, but those aren't people who are voting in the Democratic Party anyway. So it's kind of sad that we are still talking about this person, but I hope to bring an end to that soon. I want to talk about something that I saw online earlier today. And despite the fact that I just saw this today, the Pyramid of White Supremacy had apparently made its rounds within conservative networks in January. Now, Fox News reported on the fact that a college campus Salisbury University. I'm pronouncing it like the steak, not like how it's spelled. And I believe that this was a required course if you wanted to be a school teacher. If you wanted to get a degree in education from this university, then you had to take this course, and this course discussed this pyramid of white supremacy, which basically outlined a lot of what we talk about here on the show. Again, there was a group, which is basically sort of a college reform group. They are basically the college Republicans. So I don't know how much credibility there is for them to be the objective force in talking about this. They're the ones that brought it up to Fox News. Fox News covered it for several days. And so I'm hoping it's not anything like sort of nefarious or some other like plot, because anything Fox News covers tends to be about 40% just completely made up or fraudulent, or bait rather. But this pyramid does go over some interesting points. So I'm going to pull it up on the screen, and I want to talk about just from bottom to top, okay? The first thing you'll notice on this diagram is that it says, on a box to the top right, it says, in a pyramid, every brick depends on the ones below it for support. If the bricks at the bottom are removed, the whole structure comes tumbling down. So the bottom of the structure, which is adapted from Ellen Tezzulo's and Safe House Progressive Alliance for Nonviolence, it talks about different tiers of white supremacy. At the lowest, broader tier, you have indifference. It goes up to minimization. It then goes to veiled racism, then discrimination, then calls for violence, then violence itself, and finally genocide at the apex of the pyramid. I think it's important to really just understand this pyramid, whether you agree with it or not, whether you agree with everything on it, or the placement of the certain terms within the pyramid itself. It's important because this pyramid does outline some of the terminology that we use here on this show and in discussions of resistance and racism training in 101. Basic knowledge of racism has to include terms like discrimination. You can't just broadly say something's racist and believe that it's going to have a meaning, because that's such a broad term. White supremacy is also a term that many people find offensive, although many of those people are white, and they're the ones who benefit from pyramids of white supremacy. So let's break this down just a little bit. At the bottom of the pyramid, these are the sort of the covert, not really offensive offenses of racism in America, where politics doesn't affect me, so you're able to remain apolitical. Not challenging racist jokes, not confronting your racist family members when they say and do things. This is the base of the pyramid of white supremacy. And the importance of that is it's illustrating quite clearly that the people who are telling these jokes that ultimately manifest themselves into actions and harmful actions against people of color, they won't be empowered to do so if they're confronted and embarrassed about the things that they're espousing, and the lies and the racism itself, if someone confronts them at an early stage, or even often enough to where they begin to kind of be confronted and with their inner demons. You scroll up, you've got minimization, and this is really a big one, and this is one that we see online all the time, where there's this idea that there's two sides to every story, that black people need to get over slavery because it was so long ago, that not all white people. Now this is a big one, and for it to be so close to the bottom of this pyramid should let a lot of you know, and a lot of your friends know, that the not all white people thing is a serious problem. We talked about it here on the show in our episode Racism 101, or Racism for Dummies. It's complicated. It really is a challenge. This idea that we live in a post-racial society. We know that we don't. So people claiming that we live in a post-racial society because we elected Barack Obama are really lying to you. The idea that a white ally speaks over a person of color. That's very common. And I've had issues with a lot of you on Twitter for that one. false equivocation, the white savior complex. I would argue that the white savior complex should go somewhere higher up in the veiled racism thing, unless they mention paternalism somewhere, which I'll look for. Then you get on to veiled racism. Veiled racism is things like racist jokes. Paternalism, exactly. And paternalistic racism is essentially, it's when white people assume the role of a dictator in the sense of, well, we're telling you this and we're doing this for your own good. We saw tons of this in 2016 and 2015 from the Bernie Sanders campaign. These were people who were telling black voters who were by and large overwhelmingly supporting Hillary Clinton that they didn't know well enough because of all the things that had happened in the past, and that they should trust the white people who were supporting Bernie Sanders. That black people just really didn't know and couldn't make a decision for themselves. There was something in there that just wasn't really functioning, so you really just gotta take our word for it. That type of racism is called paternalism, and it's listed here as veiled racism. Racist mascots. Now, in America, we frequently have this issue with Native Americans being portrayed in the form of mascots or being mocked and mimicked. You don't see it so much with black people, but you do see, Atlanta Braves, and the Cleveland Indians and the Washington Redskins. I mean, they're still out there. These names have not changed. So those are all problematic. Let's say, claiming reverse racism. That's veiled racism. I mean, I don't think that's veiled racism. I think that's just stupid. Promoting the bootstrap theory, pull yourself up from your own bootstraps, claiming to be colorblind, little things like that. And one of the biggest ones that's listed here on this pyramid is also Eurocentric curriculum. Now, this is something that we all know exists in America, which is where the history of white Americans is the required course, and the history of people of color is an elective course that you can choose to take seriously or not choose to. You don't need it to graduate. You don't need to understand the history of, the Trail of Tears in any meaningful depth. You don't need to understand the transatlantic slave trade or the slave past or narratives or any black history significantly to really graduate. I mean, I think there's elements every now and then you roll around and you have a discussion on Martin Luther King, possibly Malcolm X, but beyond that, you really don't get much in the form of Rosa Parks, of course. You don't get much outside of that in terms of black history discussion, other issues of people of color or movements within the full-on curriculum that's broadly accepted within the United States. Then we're getting to the top half of the pyramid, which is discrimination. Now, discrimination, many people would describe as prejudice plus power equals discrimination. This means if you hold a prejudiced view against someone because of their physicality, whether it's their race, their ethnicity, their gender, their religion, their sexual orientation, those things, and then you have the power to enforce some stipulation on them, some penalty. You have the power to take away some opportunity for them. And whatever that may be, that becomes discrimination. And examples of discrimination would be, as listed in this pyramid, are hiring discrimination. That's a very, very obvious one. Things like stop and frisk, fearing people of color. Now, this is a very important one. Anti-immigration policy, funding schools locally. These are all the things that we're really seeing as a huge part and parcel of the Donald Trump administration, with Betsy DeVos and the funding schools locally. Charter schools, as opposed to taxing families and having everything go into a general fund where people go to the same schools. You now have all these smaller local schools going on, the charter schools that can be discriminatory and really can take away the opportunity for people with learning disabilities, physical disabilities, people of color, people who live in certain neighborhoods, students of different sexual orientation. All of those things now become a big problem when it comes to the Trump administration and a clown like Betsy DeVos being in charge of the DOE. racial profiling, obviously, and that really is also capped by the school to prison pipeline. It's something that we've seen over and over again in our society. And I do want to talk about the sphere of people of color. It transcends perfectly into the next tier of this pyramid, which is calls for violence. Now, calls for violence can be seen as threats or someone basically saying, you know, back in the day, we used to knock the hell out of them. They would roll out of here on a stretcher. These are things that Donald Trump said while he was running to be president. Now, calls for violence can also be by people who weaponize the police against people of color. We know in this country we have a problem with police brutality, where police officers often use excessive force against people of color, which results in their death. And when you call the police for insignificant matters that we see constantly on social media these days. The other day, there was a CVS employee who called the police on a woman for trying to use a coupon, a black woman for trying to use a coupon because he didn't recognize the coupon. And again, he is a CVS employee. His level of incompetence should not garner him calling the police on someone who's just trying to get medicine refunded, and this was expired medicine by a manufacturer. So it's really just dangerous to think that you could just leave your house, go out to get medicine, and then have the police called on you by an employee at the store that you went to for help because they were incompetent, because they weren't willing to look into the nature of the coupon or the validity of such. The pool, you know, the people calling police on you at the pool, and the fact that the police actually show up, you really can't blame the police because, you know, you call the cops, you expect them to show up because anything could happen in the time that transpires between that call and the time they actually arrive. So some of it is preventative, but you don't need to call the cops on a black person for swimming in the pool. Like, this is, I mean, really, that's just too much. All of the selling water, kids mowing lawns. I mean, there's all these things that these black children basically are having the police called on them for, or black women or black men, by white people who know that the police are invariably going to show up for their phone call and take their side, and then enforce some other policy that really isn't, you know, the real policy or rooted in any actual fact. It is discouraging and it's disgusting, and it is discrimination. And white people, you have to take the responsibility of that head on. You have to recognize that you're being racist and discriminatory when you make phone calls of that nature, where you single out black people because they're the only black people there, or black people, when you single out a black person for doing something that you yourself would do, or another white person has done or would do, and you wouldn't think anything of it. That's discrimination, because you as a white person have some element of power over this person of color in the fact that the police generally operate to your benefit. We have 3 more tiers on this pyramid. Calls for violence. This includes neo-Nazis, like we saw in Charlottesville. This resulted in deaths. Also, people like Dylann Roof, the deaths of all the people at the Charleston Church, Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston. You've got, obviously, the KKK. I would argue that the KKK is higher up on this list, though. Use of the N-word. You've got the Confederate flags, use of Confederate flags, burning of crosses, and displaying of swastikas. All of these things are part of what this pyramid aligns as calls for violence. You've got actual violence, which includes lynchings, hate crimes, and unjust police shootings. So really, this top 3 tiers, the discrimination, calls for violence, and violence, those can really almost be condensed into one thing, because there's so much overlap in how all those things so quickly transpire into the next. And the final one is genocide. And there's a lot of talk about genocide these days in the United States, and that's unfortunate. I myself have been one who just believes that what we've seen at the border with the separation of children from their families coupled with the lack of response in Puerto Rico that led to thousands of deaths. I think there's no other way to really frame this other than the word genocide. And the thing is, if the U.S. government and agencies are reporting that that there have been certain atrocities within these children, like trauma and abduction, and children are missing, anytime you've got children that are missing, you can just assume that a lot of them are dead. So, and that's harsh, but that's a fact. So you don't lose 2,000 children and then claim that they're just okay and lost in the shuffle somewhere. A lot of them are either dead now or in grave danger. And that's something we need to address. We've seen the miscarriages being admitted to. We've seen some of the other less offensive forms of death occur when it comes to migrant peoples. And we really need to get real about where we're headed as a country if we're going to address it. The first thing is to just admit that you have a problem. I think we are full steam ahead heading towards massive genocide of people of color, specifically people of Mexican heritage or Hispanic origin. And I think that's tragic. I think there's something more that all of us can do besides waiting to vote in 2018. I do want to invite you to look at this Pyramid of White Supremacy. You might see it as a tool, you might see it as propaganda. I don't know how you're going to see it, but I see it as basically factual. And it can be used as a tool to understand how grave the forces of ignorance that perpetuate racism and stereotypes are in our country, and possibly get people to take it seriously. So that things like the thousands of deaths that are occurring in Puerto Rico because of the horrible response, things that we saw before when hundreds, if not over 1,000 people died due to the lack of response in Hurricane Katrina because those were just black people, and things that we continually see in this country when we have racism or racist leaders at the helm. I want to talk about the launch of Human TV and also the release of The Counter's second season. Very excited that this week we released the first episode of the second season of The Counter. It was entitled Guys Night In, A Global Feast, Part 1. Part 2 will be released soon, and in it we really just aspire to just go over a broad swath of cultural identities where it relates to food. I think food is one of those common factors. It's one of those common grounds that we have as humans. And I think it's a really great opportunity for us to connect with each other and see that we're not as different as we may appear on the outside. On this episode, I cooked Korean food and also Spanish food with a Southern twist, and also Polynesian food. On the next episode, I will cook an African-inspired dish as well as an American-inspired dish and a South American-inspired dish. So I really want you to tune in and watch and enjoy this show. It's featured on Human.tv, which I also launched on Tuesday. This is a platform that I'm trying to build into a larger website. I really want it to basically be like a Netflix, but free to view and free of ads. We will rely on donations from viewers like you to support to make that happen, because web hosting space and domains and all those things cost money. Right now, only my content is featured on this channel, which is The Weekend 10, also The Counter Express, and Not On My Watch, this series. And I hope that over time, we'll be able to get other content providers and content creators who fit in with the scope of what we're trying to do, which is highlight content creators and voices of color. So people of color, women, LGBTQIA plus community, also immigrants, Muslims, anybody who really has some other point of view that's not mainstream and isn't pegged for the straight white male ad dollar buy. We're just trying to highlight those voices, get a community of expressions going on in one place, and maybe we'll be able to build an audience off of that and use that and mobilize that to do something powerful in the future, like resisting genocide. So I hope that you'll tune into that. Look forward to more information from that because I'll be talking about it a lot more in the coming weeks. This is the second to last episode of Not on My Watch within Season 3. Season 4 will debut in September, gearing up really a lot more towards, August. Gearing a lot more towards the election season and everything dealing with that. So I wanted to do, this is episode 19, I wanted to do at least 20 episodes in this season and then take a bit of a break and then regroup for the next phase of everything. So actually, yeah, it will be September because basically August will be off and then the last episode of this show will be aired on the last week of July, the last Thursday of July. Might be a few other small notes in between now and then. But please follow, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and then follow at human.tv because that, HUEMAN.tv, and that would be the best way to keep up with all the content as it comes up and news about the shows. As always, I'd like to thank our friends of the show. We wouldn't be able to put this on without your support. This week, I'm thanking Elizabeth C., Barry G., Josh M., Sonia J., and also Karen B. Thank you all so much for supporting and helping to bring all of this together. The launch of Human TV was not free by any means. A lot of it, and we're working on improving that and getting it to a much better platform and shirt up space in the future. So I hope you'll continue to tune in and support there. If you'd like to become a friend of the show, you can make a donation of $1 or more to www.paypal.me/jkh2. If you'd like to become a producer level sponsor of The Counter, I'd ask that you donate at least $100 to that link, www.paypal.me/jkh2, and your name will be featured in the credits of the series for the entire season. So there's 5 more episodes on the way for that season, and if you donate now at $100, your name will be in episodes 2 through 6 of the season. As always, I'd like to thank you for tuning in. Make sure to check out that pyramid and watch past episodes of The Counter as well as future episodes of The Counter at www.human.tv. That's HUEMAN.tv or at thecountertv.com. As always, I'd like to ask you to relax, relate, and resist. Thank you.
Too complex, much too complex, too complex, much too complex, too complex, too complex, too complex.